It's a privilege to be here in Queens. I gotta tell you though, it's tough to navigate Queens. You have road, terrace, street, avenue. It's a nightmare. You know, some people say, I come from Brooklyn, and some people say that Brooklyn and Queens are two different worlds. You know, I thought that I'm gonna have to go through customs to get here. I brought along a passport. You know, in Brooklyn we speak Brooklynese. I don't know if you speak Queenese. But the truth is that we have a lot in common. You see, because we all have to keep New York City's laws. And they're very, very hard. I think they're much harder than Judaism's laws. You see, first of all, alternate side. Alternate side parking is very, very hard. It's much harder than Judaism. Judaism says, remember Saturday and make it holy. New York law says, remember Tuesday and Thursday or Monday and Friday and move your car. Come on! It's terrible. Judaism says there's milk and meat. New York law says there's recycling. You have to separate your paper with your plastic. No. Paper goes separate from plastics. You have to put your plastic and glass together. And then you put your paper and aluminum separate. And then you can have your regular garbage. I gotta tell you, one time, accidentally, I mixed it up. I mixed up the paper with the glass. So I said, oh my gosh, what am I gonna do? I called up 911. They said, call 311. I called 311. I said, I have a she'elah, I have a tremendous question here. What am I gonna do? I said, can I eat it? They said, eat what? I said, I got confused with meat and milk. I'm sorry. But what am I supposed to do? I mixed the plastic with the aluminum. Judaism is simple. You got meat and dairy, that's it. And then wait, what about parking at a meter in New York? That's horrible. Think about it. In Judaism, on Passover, what makes something become leavened or chametz? 18 minutes! You have 18 minutes. In New York, if you're late 1 second for your meter, you're finished. I was late for my meter, and I got a ticket last week. So there's a woman behind me in the car, and she says, you missed it by 2 seconds. I said, you made me feel great. I said, couldn't you just put a quarter in? I would have paid you back. So people complain about Judaism, I complain about New York. Judaism is a cinch. So anyhow, I want to welcome myself to Queens. Thank you very much. But first and foremost, I want to talk to you tonight about CHAZAQ. I personally think, now I come from Manhattan, before Brooklyn, I lived in Manhattan. I was on the Upper West Side there. We had a shul, Esha Torah, on the Upper West Side. And I gotta tell you, that's the Mecca, the secular Mecca, the epicenter of the world is Manhattan. And if you want to inspire Jews, that's where to go. But you know, it's tough. It's tough to get a room full of Jews like you have over here, even in Manhattan. CHAZAQ is a phenomenal, unparalleled organization, so to speak. It may very well be. It started off an organization that just distributed a simple newsletter, and it blossomed and flourished and grew to an organization that is inspiring thousands upon thousands of Jews a week. A big round of applause for CHAZAQ. And I ask you to please support CHAZAQ in their noble, lofty, holy work, because they're doing Hashem's job, and there's nothing greater. Now I want to talk about something else. I was in Target, that's a store. I was walking there. My wife and I were shopping. We love shopping. She loves shopping. I love shopping. For Shalom Bayit, for peace in the house, I started loving shopping too. Now we do it together. It's great. So I'm in Target, and a guy stops me, and he says, excuse me, you look familiar. I said, I look familiar? He was in New York. He said, you look familiar. I said, tell me, where do you know me from? He said, I can't place it. Just 1 second. You're a movie star. I said, no, not a movie star. Rabbi Uri Zohar, who's speaking Tuesday night, he was the biggest movie star in Israel. And he changed his life around and became a religious Jew. He found the truth, he said. I'm not a movie star. He says, 1 second, were you in the post office recently, most wanted? I said, no, ask my wife, she'll tell you I'm a good guy. So where do I know you from? He says, wait, I know where I know you from. TorahAnytime.com. True story. a guy who you never imagined would watch something on TorahAnytime.com, was watching a shiur, a Torah class, because of TorahAnytime.com. When there's a Nobel Prize in Shamayim, in heaven, given for people that stuck up and that did something for Hashem and that defended Judaism and worked to disseminate Judaism, Torah Anytime will get that Nobel Prize. A big round of applause, please, for TorahAnytime.com. There was a fellow who had to go to a psychiatric hospital, not as a patient, as an observer. He walks into the psychiatric hospital, and unfortunately he sees a guy there. And the guy is banging his head against the wall. Now sometimes babies have a tendency of doing that. They said they're banging their heads against the wall. Right? You ever see that? I don't know why. Here was a 35-year-old man is banging his head against the wall, banging and banging, and he's even bruising himself. Blood is coming out. So the observer asks the psychiatrist on duty, he says, tell me, what's the guy doing? He says, go closer, listen to what he's saying. And he's banging his head, and he's saying, Rachel, Rachel, Rachel. And then again, Rachel, Rachel, and harder, Rachel, Rachel. He says, you see, he was obsessed. He was fixated with this woman. And she didn't want him. She rejected him. And ever since then, he lost his marbles. Oh, to say a tragic story, terrible story. Then he goes further in the ward, in the psychiatric hospital, and he sees another fellow. This fellow's a little older. He's around 39, 40. And he can't believe it. This guy too. He's banging his head incessantly. Rachel, Rachel, Rachel. He wasn't wearing a yarmulke. Rachel, Rachel, Rachel. So he says to the psychiatrist, the observer, he says, and tell me, what's this guy's story? He says, oh, him? He married Rachel. My friends, we cry, we bang our heads against the wall sometimes and say, if only I had my house in the Hamptons. If only I had the Mercedes that Jack around the corner has. If only I had the dream job. If only I had the kid that could get into Harvard. We cry. We bang our heads. For nothing. We whine for no reason. And Hashem looks at us. Hashem says, that's what you're crying about? You know what you should be crying about? That I had a home. I had a temple. It was in Jerusalem, in Yerushalayim. That's where my presence was. That's where you were able to visit me, to spend time with me, to love me. My home was destroyed, burnt into smithereens, ashes. That's why you should cry. You should cry because you're Jewish and you have no idea what it means to be a Jew. To live up to the mission of the chosen people. You should cry because you are called the treasured nation, the Am Segulah. And you have no idea what it means to live like a treasured nation. You know, there's a story about a man who was a millionaire. And he knew that one day he would have to bequeath and endow his family, his 4 sons, with his fortune. Over the years of working, he amassed $10 million. And he was getting old. He was already an octogenarian in his 80s. And he said to himself, I'm going to have to divide my fortune to these 4 sons. How do I know they really deserve it? After all, it's my toil and sweat. Let me see. Let me do a test. You know what he did? He hired 4 private investigators, PIs. And he said to the investigators as follows. He says, I am going to go ahead and stage my death. It's all a ruse. It was all a fake, a sketch. He wasn't dead, but he would pretend to be dead. News would go to 4 children of his 4 sons, saying, your father has died. Now it's funny, because if anybody knows about Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. You remember the story? I think it was Huckleberry Finn who went ahead. He was a kid, and he wanted to know what they'd say about him. So he pretended he was dead, and they made a big funeral for this poor kid, and he's laying in the coffin, and they get up to eulogize him. And this one guy says, he was such a fine, noble child. And somebody else says, what a nice guy. And they're singing his praises, and Huckleberry Finn jumps out of the coffin and says, 1 second, you all forgot to say how humble I am. So here this man says, I'm going to pretend I'm dead. You 4 private investigators, you go out and see how they react to my death. And the 4 went out to the 4 respective sons. And the first son, what does a private investigator overhear him saying? He hears him saying, finally I get my fortune, my $2.5 million. The old man's dead. The second son says, all right, everybody dies sometime. It's okay. Now we could have some parties. The third son says, shucks, he kicked the bucket. The fourth son was grieving and mourning, in terrible grief and sorrow and devastation. And the private investigator says to him, I don't understand. You're about to inherit $2.5 million. You can retire now for life. He says, but my father! My father! Who cares about the money? And news got back to the father. And the father sends a letter to his children. Well, they're pretty shocked to get the letter, of course. I guess with email today, anything's possible, no? And what happens is, they get to the father, and the father says, one day when I do go, one son is going to get all 10 million. Because there's only one son who cried for me. And the Rabbi Shalom, the master of the universe, he looks down at us today, and he says, who is crying for me? Who is crying for the nourishkeit, for the trivialities, for the nonsense? Most people whine and cry and are morbid and depressed about nonsense, about the temporal, ephemeral, and fleeting in life, about the nothings. But who is crying for me? Who's crying for the fact that 5 million Jews in America don't even know what to be Jewish means? Who is crying for my lost children? Who is crying for the fact that in Israel there's a city of people in Sderot that never know if they're going to live to the next day? And all of Israel is under a dire threat from Iran and from the Palestinians? Do we have Israel? We don't have Israel. We think we have Israel. We have nothing. In one split second, it can all be over, God forbid. Chas v'shalom, chalila. And God looks and God says, you know who's going to get my inheritance? Those that cry for me. Those that feel my pain. Those who want the Jewish nation to be the chosen people and the Am Segulah. They are the ones who are going to reap the dividends and who are going to have the inheritance. I got to tell you that we're running out of time. What do I mean? Tonight's lecture was entitled End of Days, Achrit Hayamim. Judaism teaches that there will be 6,000 years of civilization as we know it. As we know it, 6,000 years. Some of that period of time has to be the generations of what we call Mashiach, which means world perfection. It means no more misery, no more strife, no more pain, no more sickness. It means having a relationship with God where you know you have a loving Father who's a zillionaire who can give you anything. We're now in the year 5769 almost. We're at the brink of coming to 5769. That means we have 231 years left, and that's it. In those 231 years, you have to have the generations of Mashiach. Mashiach is not going to be for 5 years or 10 years. to be for a few hundred years. That means we are it now. We are there. And what are we doing? Where does the year 6000 come from? Very simple mathematical equation. Very, very simple. Hashem measures chronology based on 50-year spans. 50 years is the Jubilee, called Yovel. The human lifespan, the maximum approximate human lifespan is how long? We say always, we give people a blessing, a bracha, you shall live till 120. If the chronological time span of Hashem for this world is measured in 50 years, then 50 times 120 is how much? In higher math, it's 6,000. 6,000 years with 231 years left. It's almost there. But how do we know that we're at the end of days? Maybe 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Maybe that was the end of days. You know how we know? The Torah, the prophets tell us, explicitly, blatantly. It's patently clear, without a doubt. The Torah says that there is no greater proof than the end of days. You hear this? You hear the lashon, the language? It says, "Ein lecha ketz mikulam mizeh." There is no greater proof to the end of days. It means it's ironclad, definitive, conclusive. In a court of law, it is something that is without a doubt. How do you know? When the Jews come back to Israel after thousands of years of dispersion and exile, the Torah says, when the Jews come back and they make Israel grow again. What do I mean grow again? Mark Twain, the famous Gentile author, a great man. In the 19th century, that means in the 1800s, he went to what was called Palestine, Israel. And he writes about his trip. He says there was total devastation, total ruination, total desolation, total nothingness. Nothingness! That's what Israel was. And that's what Israel was for almost 1,900 years. For almost 1,900 years. And then suddenly, starting around 1948, Israel, Eretz Israel, changes. And from desolation, ruination, and devastation, it's transformed as a metamorphosis, a total transformation. To Israel becomes the most powerful nation in the Middle East, and one of the world leaders with the 4th greatest military, some say the 3rd greatest military in the world. Not only that, Israel by nature, anybody here from Israel? Raise your hand, please. Okay, that's wonderful. All right, great. Israel. I thought you looked familiar. Israel has no natural resources. There's no water. There's no petroleum. And yet, Israel is a bastion. Thank you. Israel is a bastion in the Middle East where all the other countries are trying to replicate its methodology to enable things to grow. Guess what? Do you know who invented Windows? Israel. Do you know who invented instant messaging? What would we do without instant messaging? Think about it. You know what we'd have to do? We'd have to actually pick up a phone. Pick up a phone and talk to somebody. Come on. Nobody does it anymore. That's from the 1200s. My great-great-great-great-grandfather, he picked up the phone. And me today, instant message. You don't even have to talk to anybody. It's a good way. You don't have to hang up on anybody. If you don't want to speak to somebody, it's wonderful. Cell phones come from Israel. The greatest technology all comes from a land that Mark Twain, an objective source, a Gentile writer who is famous, writes for almost 1,900 years, was nothing. Nothing grew. Nothing at all. Totally unproductive. Totally desolate. Says the Torah. It gives a prophecy. It says that when you see Israel having a metamorphosis, a transformation, a change like never before. Now think about it. The Jews were in exile for thousands of years. They saw this prophecy. What did they think? They could have thought, come on, it's impossible. It's a joke. It's a joke. But we see it. We are the generation who sees miracles
We see it firsthand. We see a prophecy come alive. We see God, without a doubt, at work. To the extent that there's a Soviet historian who writes that if you study Israel's history, specifically this point that I mentioned, you understand, he says then, that history has to be described as meta-history or para-history. In other words, it's not normal. It's miraculous. A Soviet communist atheist wrote this. We are at the end of days, without a doubt. The end of time, as we know it. But I'll give you another proof. An amazing prophecy. Nebuchadnezzar was the one who destroyed the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, which we will be commemorating the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash this coming Sunday. Hopefully we won't have to. The Jews were taken after 850 years in Israel. They were thrown out by Nebuchadnezzar, cast out. There was a prophet of the Jewish people, a tzaddik, a holy man named Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu HaNavi. And Yirmiyahu HaNavi said that for 70 years the Jewish people will be in exile, but after 70 years they will return. But there's something very cryptic. There's something very deep. Because the Pasuk also tells us, according to the Kabbalistic commentators, that there will come a time in the end of days, Achrit Hayamim, when Babylonia will be rebuilt for 70 years and then destroyed again. The Zohar tells us that history repeats itself because history is not linear like a line. History is a circle. Everything comes back. All the ancient rulers are reincarnated and come back. All the events we are faced with again. I want to tell you a story. There was a fellow David in Jerusalem. This fellow, every Friday night, he would look in the Beit HaKnesset, in the Knish, in the Shul, in the synagogue, and he would see, maybe there's somebody who doesn't have a meal. Maybe there's somebody I can invite to my home who's hungry or who wants to be inspired with Shabbat. And one Friday night in Jerusalem, the story happened around 10 years ago. He sees a guy standing in the back with a knapsack, a briefcase on his shoulders. And the fellow has black curly hair. He's dark-skinned. And he's alone. He's in solitude. He's isolated from everybody else. So David goes over to him and David says, perhaps you'd like to come here and join me in my house for a Shabbat meal. And the fellow was ecstatic. He says, yes, I'd like to come. So they sit there at the table with David's wife and David's children. And David says, now, before we eat the soup, it's customary for us to sing a song. What song would you like us to sing? We'd like to honor you, our guest, with a song. The guest said, I would like us to sing that song they sang in the synagogue, the Dodi song. And he's referring to a song that we sing every Friday night, Lecha Dodi. So David and his family start singing, Lecha Dodi, Nikras Kala, Pinei Shabbos Nikabela. And David's listening. Of course, he's singing, I'm sorry. The guest is listening. And the guest is listening and he's enthralled. And then after the soup, David says to his guest, he says, you know, we have a custom before we bring out the main course to sing again. What song would you like us to sing? And the guest says, I want to hear that Dodi song again. Okay? Lecha Dodi, Likras Kala, la da 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 da. They sing. And the guest is captivated. He's intrigued. Then before dessert, David says to his guest, you know, we have a custom, the next meal, we sing a song. What song would you like us to sing? And he says the Goldie song. By now, David and his family are worried that the neighbors are going to think there's a broken record. Crazy. Nuts. Hazid. But they sing it again. And they're singing again and again. And then after dessert, they sing it again, and then they sing it again, and then again. And finally, it's coming out of David's ears. But after the kids went to the bed, and the wife was in the kitchen doing the dishes, David says to his guest, he says, you know, I didn't even really get your name. I got so distracted with the kids, and you know, everything was such a ruckus. I forgot to, what's your name? So he says, Mohammed. Oh, Mohammed. He says, where are you from? He says, Ramallah. He says, oh, you're from Ramla. Yeah, I have cousins there. He also has a cousin there, you see. No, he says, no, you didn't hear me. Because Ramla is a Jewish town. He says, no, you didn't hear me. I come from Ramallah. So poor David is opening up his shirt, and he's having a panic attack, and he's having heart palpitations, and he's hyperventilating, and they have to call the paramedics. Poor David. And he says, wait, let me explain. Oh. The guest says, let me tell you a story. I grew up, and my father, he says, was a rabid anti-Semite. He's a Jew hater. He aspired to be a Jew killer, I'm sure. And that's how he raised me. But with me, it never resonated. I was never able to reconcile the fact that you could believe in a religion of peace, so to speak, which is Islam, and yet hate people so viciously and so sadistically and cruelly. So I said to my mother one day, I said, I'm sick and tired of my father's behavior. And his father would reprimand him and hit him. When he would ask questions, he'd slap him, and very cruel and dangerous. He goes to his mother, he says, I'm sick and tired. I'm leaving. I'm going into Israel proper. And you never even know, maybe out of spite and dejection for my father, I'll even become Jewish. His mother said, you don't have to become Jewish. You are Jewish. She says, you see, I grew up in a nice Jewish family, but I was lured and enticed by the glitz of some guy that I met. When I disobeyed my family, I started hanging out with the wrong people. I went to a bar, and this really handsome Middle Eastern looking guy, who I didn't even know was an Arab, he seduced me, and we got married. He says, so you're Jewish. That's what she says. And she says, if you don't believe me, I have a picture to prove it. I'm going to give this, take this with you. It's a picture of my ancestors when they came to Israel. I believe it was from Morocco or someplace. When they were visiting the grave of their great ancestor who was a very holy man. So David says to his guest, Mohammed from Ramallah, he says, can I see the picture? And the guest says, certainly. Takes out the picture, and David looks at it, and David starts crying. The picture was of the guest's ancestors visiting the tombstone, the grave of Rabbi Shlomo Al-Kabetz, who was the author of L'chad Dodi. And that's why he was so intrigued and fascinated and fixated by the song, because it was written by his ancestor, his neshama, his Jewish soul, was inspired and ignited. You see, because I started off talking about recycling, the paper, the aluminum, the glass, but history is really all about recycling. It's really a Jewish innovation, it's a Jewish invention. We don't know who our souls are. And as I said before, the Zohar says that in the end of days, everything comes back. All of ancient history comes back. So we spoke about Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed the first temple, who brought the Jews into captivity and exile for 70 years. But remember, there's an amazing, astounding prophecy that says that in the end of days, the 70-year cycle of Babylonia comes back to be destroyed again. Anybody remember Saddam Hussein? As President Bush used to like saying, well, how did he call him? Saddam. No, Saddam. Saddam Hussein told everybody, and this is quoted on the religious sources, This is from secular biographers and historians that Saddam Hussein believed with his heart and soul that he was Nebuchadnezzar reincarnate. He was the Gilgul of Nebuchadnezzar. Do you know that in 1982, Saddam Hussein excavated Nebuchadnezzar's palace, his 600-room palace that Nebuchadnezzar made, and he laid 60 million bricks, Saddam Hussein, on the bricks of Nebuchadnezzar, writing from Saddam Hussein, who was the resurrector of ancient Babylonia. The new Nebuchadnezzar, so to speak. He had a brigade in his army that he called the Nebuchadnezzar Brigade, and in 2001, he formed an army of 7 million people to liberate what he called the Jerusalem army in order to liberate Palestine. He was a man that paid all the suicide bombers' families $25,000 apiece for anybody who killed a Jew. And he was a man who said it without hiding it. There was no clandestine operations with Saddam Hussein. He said it the way it was. He said, I am Nebuchadnezzar. I am going to annihilate and decimate the Jewish people again. But this time, in entirety. Israel, he said, will be wiped away. Saddam Hussein, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar comes back. But think about it. Listen to this amazing prophecy. When was Iraq established? When was it founded? It was founded by the League of Nations in 1932. Because before that, the entire Middle East was under Ottoman rule. And finally, in 1932, the League of Nations went ahead and apportioned out different chunks of the Middle East. And one area and section became modern-day Iraq. But how long did modern-day Iraq last? Exactly 70 years, until George W. Bush went in and invaded Iraq. Just like the Navi says. Do you hear that? How could you be the same person tomorrow now if you hear the Nubuah of the Torah? You hear it so clearly, are you going to be the same person? You are God's chosen people. You are the ones that the prophecy is about. What did Saddam Hussein call the nuclear reactor that he built in order to annihilate the Jewish people? He called it Tammuz, because Tammuz was the month that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed or attempted to besiege Jerusalem and the temple. And Baruch Hashem, a nace, a miracle happened, and Israel was able to destroy the nuclear reactor in 1981. But if we study history even more deeply, we see something amazing. You see, we all know about the great flood that happened in the world, the Mabul. The world was living a decadent lifestyle. They were sinning left and right. Even the animals were sinning. The world was so corroded morally that God sent the Mabul, and the only survivors were Noah and his 3 sons and their families. But right after the Mabul, Noah went ahead and he did like all Jewish boys like doing, which they shouldn't. And he had some Chivas Regal, he had some Scotch, whiskey, he had some Budweiser, and he mixed it, he mixed drinks, and he got a little drunk. And he was laying there inappropriately, not clad exactly. And one son saw it and made fun and scoffed at it and ridiculed his father and embarrassed his father. That was Ham. And Ham's descendants were cursed, some of them, that they would be slaves. But Shem and Yefet, they went ahead and they treated their father with dignity and respect. They honored their father. And therefore Hashem gave a blessing. Listen to this blessing very, very carefully because it impacts you and me. Listen. Yaf Elokim liyefes v'yishkon be'al Shem. The blessing was that there would be a man Yefes who would have descendants. His descendants would be, it says explicitly in the Torah, it would be Greece, Rome, Persia. And God says that the Jewish people, the Shemites, the Semites, are supposed to be holy, are supposed to do God's work here in the world, make it a beautiful, loving place, a welcoming place. But what are the Yefes people supposed to do? The Yefes people are supposed to make it, facilitate that the God's chosen people, the Jewish people, could do their work. And God said as follows, through his prophet Isaiah, Yeshaya HaNavi. He said there will come a time when the first temple will be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia. But you know what's amazing? What's amazing is that who was the very first king of Babylonia? Ham, his descendant. You see, Ham usurped the kingship from Yefes. Nimrod was the first king of Babylonia. He did a no-no, a violation. And God says that there's going to come a time in the future when Yefes will reinstate himself as the monarchy, as the aristocracy in the world. And when will that be? After the first temple is destroyed, there will be a king whose name was Koresh, King Cyrus. And King Cyrus will be appointed by God as sort of the Mashiach to rebuild the second temple and usher in a redemption for the Jewish people after they were so barbarically expelled from their land and persecuted and sent to Babylonia. Koresh will be the one to bring them back and to rebuild the second temple and to bring in redemption for the Jewish people. You hear this? Koresh, the descendant of Yefes. But something went wrong because Koresh didn't do his job. He allowed them to build a second temple, but only 42,360 Jews went from Iraq, from Babylonia, back to Israel. And after a little while, Koresh said, you cannot build the temple any longer. Koresh was the king of Persia. Persia. Who is Persia today? Who is Persia? Let's go. No. Who's Persia? Iran. Listen to this amazing thing. Amazing. This is so astounding that if you don't fall off your chair, something's wrong. The Torah has an astounding prophecy. The Torah says that in the end of days, there will only be 3 superpowers in the world. 3 nations left that are most prominent, that are in the news every single day without fail. You know who they are? The Torah says that at the end of days, Hashem is going to ask the nations of the world, what did you do to help my Jewish people be who they're supposed to be? So you know what? There are nations like the French Napoleon made the French Revolution, and he liberated the Jews, so to speak. He gave them free rights. In Germany, they had free rights. In America, we have free rights. So the nations are going to be able to say, I did something. I let them do what they're supposed to do. I gave them the rights to practice their Judaism. But the Torah only records 2 nations that are going to give answers. Out of all the nations in the world, you know who they are? Rome, which most Kabbalists tell us is modern-day America. Rome. And guess what? Persia. But Persia had a name change in 1935 because they wanted to associate with the Aryans, with the Nazis. And therefore, they changed their name from Persia to Iran Aryan. The Torah tells us explicitly that there will be 2 nations left. And a third, Israel. The Jewish people, Iran, and America. That's it. Why? Why these nations? You know why? Because when it came to the second temple to be rebuilt, Cyrus, Koresh, the king of Persia, was supposed to be the enabler. He was supposed to ennoble and enable and facilitate for the Jews to have a temple. He was supposed to fulfill his role of Yefes, to enable shame the Jewish people, and he failed. And therefore he has to come back at the end of days to suffer the ramifications and repercussions. He has to be embarrassed. But you know what? You see, Persia is going to war with its ancient enemy. Because see, Persia was the greatest empire in the world at the time for many, many years. The greatest. It spread continents. But the Greece came, Alexander the Great, and finished them off. And Greece morphed into Rome. And then Rome took over the world. Well, guess what's happening? It's a vicious cycle. Today, Persia wants to ascend again as the world leader. Now, you'll ask me a question. How do I know that today's Iran is ancient Persia? After all, ancient Persia were not Muslims. They weren't Arabs. The Iran of today, Ahmadinejad, he believes that he is the harbinger for the 12th imam that has to come to bring what they call their Mashiach. And therefore he talks about this apocalyptic, cataclysmic event that will bring their Mashiach and means all the Jews, the Christians, and infidels will die. So how can I say that ancient Persia, which wasn't even Muslim or Arabic, Arabics come from Shem, Semites. How can I then dare say that contemporary Persia, Iran, is ancient Persia? It's a good question. I want to read to you from an ancient source which talks about exactly what will happen in the end of days. Listen to this Kabbalistic source. Anybody under 40, please leave. No, just joking. You can be under 40. It's not real Kabbalah. Rabbi Yitzchok. Rabbi Yitzchok said, I love that name. My name. Shana Shemalach HaMashiach. The year that Mashiach will come. Listen to this. You are reading the news before it happens. Can you imagine? Kol Malchi Umot Ha'olam Mitkavim Zeh B'zeh. All the nations will be struggling one with the other. There will be total unrest. Melech Paras, the king of Persia, Mitkarev b'Melech Arabi, will fight, will have strife and contest the king of Arabia. Listen. V'holech Melech Arabi la Rome. The king of Arabia will go to America. Lital Eit Samehem, to ask them advice. V'chazar Melech Paras, u'machrivet kol olam, and the king of Persia will try to destroy the entire world. V'chol umot ha'olam mitra'ashim u'mitra'alim v'noflim al pneihem v'yechot osam sirim kitzir leila. The entire world will be in disarray. We will be in convulsions. There will be unrest. There will be trauma. V'Yisrael mitra'ashim u'mitra'alim, and the Jewish people will be just as confounded and in pain, and they will say to Hashem, where are we going to go? Iran is threatening us. Iran has a nuclear reactor that could blow us off the face of the earth. Where are we going to go? Hashem will answer them. Bini, my son. Oh, titra'u, don't be afraid. Kol masha asiti lo asiti el b'shvilchem. The entire world revolves because of you. All the events of history, all of modern events, all of contemporary news is happening because of you, each and every one of you. Why are you nervous? Why are you afraid? Your time for redemption has arrived. And the first redemption will pale, will be nothing compared to this one. Because the first redemption, you were still slaves. You were still in exile. This one is going to be final. I have a question. It says that the king of Persia, what we say is Iran, will go to the king of Saudi Arabia and start up and fight with him. Now let me ask you a question. It calls the king of Saudi Arabia the king of the Arabs. Isn't Iran also Arabic? Why does it refer to them as non-Arabs? And the answer is so beautiful. All you have to do is study history. And you'll know that Iran is the only nation in the Middle East that's not Semitic. They're non-Arabs. They are not Arabs. They are from Yefes. They are Indo-European. They are Paras, Persia, from way back. They're not true Arabs. And that's why they are despised. They are the only Shiite nation in the entire Middle East. And versus the other Arabs, there are 85% of the Arabs are Sunnis. Only 15% are Shiites. And that's why he refers to Paras, not as Arabs, but as the king of Persia in the end of days, versus the Arab world. Because if you remember in 1987, all right, anybody want to confess that they were alive in 1987? In 1987, Saudi Arabia got very scared of Iran because there was the Iran-Iraq war, and Saudi Arabia threatened that they're going to have to take retribution possibly because the Iranians are making problems in the Arab world. In more recent times, in 2005, National Geographic magazine went ahead and they wrote that there's a big problem. They called it Iran versus the Arab world. Because the National Geographic magazine made a mistake in the issue on the map. Instead of calling it the Persian Gulf, they called it the Arabic Gulf. Ooh, Iran is not Arabic. And that's why many Iranians refuse to call themselves Iranian. They want it to be called Persians. Because they are not Arabs. They are Persians from way back. The original Persians. And they are coming back. And the Talmud asks the question the Torah asks. Torah says, who's going to win the war? Will it be the Christians, America, or will it be Iran? And there's one opinion that says that even though the Persians originally were the ones who rebuilt the second temple, King Cyrus, Koresh, Amelech, and the Romans were the ones who destroyed it, this time, the Persians are going to lose, even though they had the zchut, the merit of rebuilding the second temple temporarily. Perhaps the Talmud says that it's a pele. Because why should the rebuilders end up suffering the fate that the destroyers should get? Rome, maybe America should suffer, not Persia. After all, Persia rebuilt the second temple. And the Talmud answers, Gezerat Melech. It's a decree of God, which we can't necessarily understand, but perhaps in light of what we just proposed, we could understand it. Maybe. You see, because Persia messed up. They were supposed to be the ones to bring the Mashiach, to enable the Jewish people to live the way they were supposed to. And instead, another descendant of Yefes, perhaps Christian America, will have that zchut. We don't know. Time will tell. The hour is late. But I want to tell you, if you have any doubt in my mind that what I'm saying is true, research it. You don't have to take my word at face value. But you got to be crazy not to believe it, because it's factual. It's history. The same way Benjamin Franklin, it's undeniable, it's indisputable, lived what I'm telling you. It's written. It's all there. That means that we are living in times that nobody ever dreamed of. And what are we going to do? Are we going to seize the moment to do tshuva? Are we going to be better Jewish people? Are we going to live up to our mission? Or are we going to fail and lose out? It's up to you. There are things that you could do to make sure that Iran doesn't win. Because if you think about it, and this is true, Iran right now is winning. They have in the north Hezbollah, which is basically Shiite, and they have control of. In the south, they have Hamas, which interestingly enough is Sunni, but they have such hatred for the Jewish people that they've collaborated, these ancient enemies, the Shiites and the Sunnis. They have Syria, they have Iraq, and they are trying to get world dominion to restore themselves as the empire of the world and destroy the Jews. We will not let it happen. I'm going to tell you some constructive things you could do. Smile. The greatest mitzvah in the Torah is to walk around happy. If you're happy, happy. Be happy. What are you sad about? What are you crying about? If you want to cry, cry about the pain of God that his children are lost from him. Otherwise, be happy. Walk around happy. Another thing you could do, learn Torah. Go to the source. Go where you come from, the Torah. Make sure every single day, a day doesn't pass that you haven't studied, learned Torah. And another thing, do random acts of chesed, kindness. Every day, take a little book out before you go to sleep and say, what did I do today to put a smile on somebody else's face? Aside from smiling, what did I do to uplift the spirit of a person? I want to conclude with a story. There was a child in a school who was your nightmare child. The school psychologist, my mother-in-law is here, she's a school psychologist. The school psychologists, they hated him. They ate him up. The kid was a menace, he was a terror. He caused a ruckus and mayhem and bedlam in the school. Every single day there was another problem. Finally, one day, the teacher says, go to the principal's office, and the teacher was hoping that the kid would be expelled. The kid sits there in the principal's office. The next day, the kid was back in school, and he was changed forever. He was the best kid, graduated valedictorian. The best kid in the school. The teachers, it was the greatest enigma, it was the greatest conundrum. Nobody knew how or why. Nobody could figure it out. How do you take a terror and convert him to the best kid in the school overnight? But they were afraid to ask him because there's a Jewish law that says that if somebody changes for the good, you're not supposed to remind them of their past. It's a beautiful law. Isn't that gorgeous? Special? Beautiful? So they finally mustered up the courage. They went to the principal at the end of the year. They said to the principal, "How do you do it? You're an educational genius. You should be an instructor to all the school psychologists, to all the social workers, to all the teachers, because you made history." You know what the principal said? "I'll tell you," he said. Tooting his horn. He said, "I'll tell you what I did. Nothing. 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 I don't remember doing anything. I don't know what it was." Now they had to ask the kid. Because they figured, even though you're not supposed to remind somebody, but it would do such a service to the world over. They could improve so many school systems. They asked the kid, "How did you change? Why did you change from being the worst kid to the best kid?" You know what the kid said? The kid said, "I was sitting there in the principal's office, and he was berating me and chastising me and lambasting me. He was knocking me down. I was really bad. But suddenly, there's a phone call. And the principal picked up the phone, and he said to whoever it was on the other line, could have been the President of the United States of America for all I know. He said, "I can't talk to you now because I have somebody very important in my office." He said, the kid said, "I went home that night, I lay in my bed, and all that resonated in my mind was very important in the office." And I realized he was talking about me. You see, I never viewed myself as very important. But once I looked at myself as very important, I realized I can't behave the way I did in the past. I'm very important. And ever since then, anytime he was going to misbehave, he said, "I'm very important." Each and every one in the room here, we are all very important. We are God's chosen people. The Am HaNivchar, the Am Sigula, the Mamlechet Kohanim, the Goy Kadosh, the kingly people, the nation of priests. When we go out in the world, we're living in a world in America, 15 to 18,000 new cases of AIDS. It just was reported every year in America. 50 to 60,000 people die of AIDS every year. We're living in a polluted, contaminated world. We're living in a world that we can make a difference, where we can bring our holiness. We're living in a world where it's the end of days. But Rabotai, my friends, let us make that end of days the beginning of an era of Mashiach, of peace, love, and a resurgence of Torah and mitzvot. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening.